The topic for tonight is, how do we know the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice, what is obligatory or forbidden or permissible? How do we have moral knowledge? How do we know what morality requires of us? There's a very simple answer to this question. I think many people subscribe to the answer. We know because God told us. Look at the things that He commanded us, look at the things that He revealed to us, and that's how we know, because He told us. And indeed, they may say, it has to be that way because who other than God would have the authority to determine that something's really right and really wrong? Not just acceptable to your culture and your time or to your particular judgment, but really right and really wrong would have to come from God. And witnesses the variations even in contemporary society, let alone the changes over history. Human standards can't be trusted. And that would mean that if God hadn't told us what's right and what's wrong, then we wouldn't know. We would have no claim to have moral knowledge if He hadn't told us. There are facts recognized by the Jewish tradition which are inconvenient for this point of view. Let me share a few of them with you. God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. If the report that I have heard is brought to me about their evil, then I'm going to destroy them. Well, Abraham responds with a multifaceted complaint against God's statement. First of all, he says, if you mean you're going to destroy it by killing everyone there, including the righteous people there, that's wrong. You can't do that. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Now let's see. If all morality comes from God, if we know what's right or wrong only because God told us, why doesn't God say to Abraham, Abraham, you need to go back to philosophy 1. You need to start over. All morality comes from me. I make morality. So when I do something, it's automatically moral. When I do it, it's moral, period. God doesn't say that to Abraham. He makes it clear that He's not going to destroy the righteous. Let's take another case. There's a famous problem throughout Jewish history, throughout Jewish literature, and that's Tzaddik V'Ralo, a righteous person who's suffering. The book of Job is largely about that subject. The book of Job was authored by Moses. So it's a very old problem. And essays on it are still being written within our tradition, let alone the external philosophy. What exactly is the problem? Well, here's this person who's suffering. Now, suppose he's righteous. Well then, why should he be suffering? And if you tell me that suffering is an investment in some future good, which sometimes it is, okay, so I'll put that into the question. Let's suppose he's suffering in such a way that he hasn't done anything wrong to deserve it as a punishment, and it's not going to produce any future good. Well then, God can't do that. That's the problem, because God is morally perfect. So God can't visit suffering on someone who didn't deserve it as a punishment, and it doesn't do anything good for him. Now, when this question is raised, the answer is always, you got one of the two premises wrong. Either he really did do something wrong, and you don't know about it, or it really will produce some future good, and you don't know about it. No one says, stop the music. The question is idiotic. You're talking about God. You can't put rules on God. You can't tell God what to do. What do you mean he has to do it this way? Nothing binds God. Nothing requires anything of God. And if he wants to cause suffering to an innocent person, which produces no future good, it will be morally good because he does it, because he's the source of morality. He creates it. He makes it moral by saying so. Nobody says that. No one offers that as a way to solve the problem. I'll give you a third case. There are Sforim which ask the question, what reason do we have to keep the commandments? What is it that obligates us to follow God's commandments? And one of the reasons given, this is only one of many, yes, there are other considerations as well, but one of the reasons given is gratitude. Consider how much God is doing for you. Consider how much good you receive from God. That good that he gives you creates an obligation. And when he then says, I'm commanding you to do this, because you've received so much good from him, you're obligated to do what he says to do. That's written in the Sforim. Shimon Shkop, in the Shar Yashar, Shar Daled Perek Beis, asks the following question. You're telling me I have an obligation to keep God's commandments because I owe a debt of gratitude. And that debt of gratitude obligates me to follow his commandments. Where does the obligation to pay debts of gratitude come from? Where does that rule come from? Where does that obligation come from? Where does the moral push to pay debts of gratitude come from? And he considers the following answer. The Torah says so. The Torah says that you have to pay debts of gratitude. That can't be right. That can't be right because we are asking for a reason to keep the Torah. You can't tell me the reason you have to keep the Torah is the Torah says you have to keep the Torah. That's not an answer. The person who's asking the question is standing outside. He sees this system with all of its commandments, and he's asking, why should I pledge allegiance to that system? You've got to give him a reason that comes before all the commandments. The reason is given. Gratitude. It must be that the obligation to pay debts of gratitude isn't based on the fact that the system says so. Because if it were, it couldn't be used as a reason for following the system. So these are some facts which are inconvenient for the idea that we know what's right and wrong because God told us. We know it because he revealed it to us, because he commanded us. These facts don't fit that system. And these are Jewish facts. I'm not talking about external philosophy. That's another independent consideration, which someday we might go into. I'm talking about developing a position that's faithful to the Jewish sources. And the fourth source that I want to give you, which I think is the most explicit and is extremely powerful, is the Rambam. He's not the only one who holds this position, but the Rambam says it in very explicit terms. And this is Hilchos Tshuva Perek Hey, the 5th chapter of the Laws of Tshuva, at the very beginning. I will translate it for you. Power is given to every person. The word reshus here in Hebrew doesn't mean permission. It means power, as you'll see. Power is given to each person if he wills or desires to incline himself to a good path and to be a tzaddik, righteous. The power is in his hand. And if he wills or desires to incline himself to an evil path and be wicked, the power is given to him. It's in his hand. This is what the famous verse in Genesis says. Hein ha'adam haya ka'achad bimenu l'das tov v'ra. Now, the standard translation you have of this verse, I'll tell you, and I will point out to you that Maimonides disagrees with this translation. The standard translation is, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. The Rambam does not accept that translation. The Rambam's translation is as follows: Hein ha'olam hoya ka'achad, comma, behold, man has become unique. Mimenu ladas tov v'ra, knowing from himself good and evil. He knows by himself good and evil. It's internal to him. It's his own given knowledge. Doesn't come from any external source. He knows by himself doing what is good and evil. Yes, he breaks up the verse in a way that's not stated in most translations. And in case you didn't get it, he explains it to you. Kolomar, that is to say, behold, this species of humanity is unique in the world, and there is no other species like him in this respect, that he me'atzmo, bidato, ub'machshavto, from himself, with his knowledge and with his thought, yodea hatov v'hara, he knows good and evil. That's pretty explicit. Me'atzmo, bidato, ub'machshavto, from himself, with his knowledge and with his thought. That definitely rules out an external source, which is the source of his knowledge of good and evil. No, he knows it internally. He's created with it. Ve'oseh kol ma shehu chafetz ve'ein lo mi sheyakev al yado milatzos hatov v'hara. And he also can do what he desires to do. Nothing stops him from doing good or evil. So let's go back to the beginning. He says every man is given the power to incline himself to the good and be righteous, or to incline himself to the evil and be wicked. That power includes two things. Number one, he has to have knowledge of good and evil. Otherwise, he can't incline himself to the good if he doesn't know what it is. Or incline himself to, he can do it accidentally, he might have by accident, but he can't make the choice to be good if he doesn't know what good is. Can't make the choice to be evil if he doesn't know what evil is. So this idea of his power to be good or be evil, become good, become evil, includes the knowledge. That's the first thing the Rambam says. And second of all, nothing forces him to act one way or another. He has the power to act as he pleases. And that's why he really has the power to choose to be good or choose to be evil. And if you say, but Rabbi, I don't understand Maimonides. How could he translate the verse that way? He puts a comma in the wrong place, so to speak, and he makes up this explanation. And then if you talk to an academic, he will tell you his deeply prejudiced, irrational view that Maimonides was a Spanish philosopher, and he was influenced by Arabic philosophy, and all that kind of stupid nonsense. Maimonides himself points out that this way of translating the verse is identical to Unclus Hager. Unclus, who made the Aramaic translation of the Torah 1,000 years before him. Unclus was not a Spanish philosopher. He certainly wasn't moved by the kind of philosophical ideas that people push onto the Rambam. And he translates it in exactly the same way. So Maimonides is telling us that we all naturally have, and by the way, he's not speaking about Jews here. He's speaking about people. People have knowledge of good and evil because that's the way God created them. Now, before people misunderstand me, I made the title tonight, How Do You Know? I didn't make the title, What Makes It Right and Wrong? What makes it good and evil? I didn't ask that question. They're related. Yes, they are related questions, but they're separate questions. I want to know, how do I know what's right and wrong? The answer can't be because God wrote it in a book. That can't be the answer. There's something internal to the human being that already gives them our ability to know what right and wrong are. Now, what I've said so far is ambiguous, but I want to see whether there are questions up to here, because then I'll go on to clarify and refine things. Yeah.
So if that's the case, that it's also based on our own understanding.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
If it's the case that it's also based on our own understanding, then surely something like, say, like killing a Molech or something, which seemingly where God commands one thing and instinctively you feel another, it's a contradiction. Which one was?
Okay, so now one question that he raises is, if we know what's good and evil, right and wrong on our own, then what happens when there's a commandment that violates what we know to be right? Well, did we ever hear about that idea before? Maybe tonight, about 6 minutes ago? Wasn't that Abraham's complaint about Sodom and Gomorrah? So that's got to be a good complaint. It's got to be a good complaint. Abraham raised it. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? So then the answer will have to be, you're misunderstanding the commandment, or you're misunderstanding the context of the commandment and what its consequences are. Not, God is God, and God can do whatever He pleases, and is beyond all judgment, all limitation. That's not the Jewish answer. So that kind of question is a very relevant question. And the Rishonim, the Gemara asks it on occasion, and the Rishonim asks the question, and usually what they say is that there are consequences or background that you're not aware of. And if you would be aware of the rest of the picture, you would see that in moral terms it really is right. One answer, which some give, is reincarnation. So you're looking at this person from birth to death as if that's his whole career, his whole history. But he's been here before. And that's part of his history also. And would you know the previous chapters in his history, then you would see why this happening to him here is a morally relevant thing for it to happen to him. But again, as I said before, notice that the answer always is, your moral judgment is correct, and the facts will bear out that it really is moral. Not, God is beyond morality, and God creates morality, and He says He makes the rules, He can violate the rules, and so on and so on. That's not the answer. The answer is that the rules of morality are there. Yeah.
Would this imply that all our moral intuitions are the same then?
Okay, this is an interesting question. It's a question which requires more time than I can give it now. Would this imply that all our moral intuitions are the same? The truth is that moral intuitions are much more common than is generally appreciated. And I'll tell you why, because this is a very important point that's relevant here. When you take a concrete case and ask, what is right to do, what is wrong to do, your answer depends upon two different sorts of factors. And both sorts of factors contribute to your answer. Call them A and B. So when you see two people or two groups of people who differ on a particular case, it's not obvious where you should trace the difference to. Is the difference in factors A, or is the difference in factors B? Because the judgment is based on both factors A and factors B. And if you think it's only based on A and you trace it to A, you're being short-sighted, you're not correctly describing the situation. Now what are A and B? A is your moral principles, and B is the facts of the case. In particular, the consequences of acting one way or another way in a particular circumstance. And it can be that people disagree about what's right to do in a particular case because they disagree about what will happen if you do this or that. Not what's right or wrong abstractly, in principle, but what will actually happen if you do this way or do that way. So when you see a difference of practice, that doesn't automatically mean there's a difference of moral principle. In fact, it almost never means there's a difference of moral principle. It's usually, almost always, a matter of a difference of facts. And let me give you a couple of examples of cases where people want to enforce the opposite point of view and show you why, instead of supporting them, the case actually supports what I'm saying. Did the Nazis have different values, let's say from us? Different values. So, well, exterminating people and concentration camps and genocide. Well, what are you talking about? Of course they did. Really? Well, then tell me something. Why did the Nazis make up the myth that Jews are evil? Why did they need that? What did they use it for? Jews control the economy, and Jews are poisoning the wells, and Jews want to take over the world, and Jews are cheating us out of our money. Jews cost us the First World War. Why bother making up those stories? What good do they do you? What you really should say is, Jews are honest people, nice people, productive people. We kill them anyway. We have different values. We kill nice people. No? They didn't say that. Why? Why did they bother? When the European colonists came to North America, and they actually enunciated explicitly a program of controlling the continent from sea to shining sea, as the song says, right? The only trouble was that there are people in between, you see, and controlling it means taking away their land. Oh, but they're not people. They're not human. Having a red skin means you're not human. That's the story that they told. Why did they bother? Why did they simply say, sure, they're people, we're taking it away because we have guns, that's all. We just take away things from people because that's what we do. You don't take away from people, you have your values. We do take away from people, we have our values. Nobody said that. Why not? Because you can't take land from people. You can't do that. That's wrong. So you change the facts. You say they're not people. You can't just exterminate people. Can't do that. But what if they're your enemy? What if they're using their power to threaten you? Then you're killing them in self-defense. That morality allows you to do. That's the purpose of the myth. The purpose of the myth is to be able to kill Jews with the old values, the same familiar values, not with new values. You even take slavery, even slavery. All the ancient philosophers believed in slavery. It's from the Greek philosophers. Greece had large slave holdings. I saw one reference that at one point in time there were 20 slaves for each free person. How did they justify that? They justified it as follows. If you're Greek, you're cultured, you're civilized, you live a truly human life. If you're not Greek, you're a subhuman. That is to say, you're a being, but you're living a subhuman life. It's of benefit to a subhuman to incorporate him into a real human community and realize his value and his capacities in a way which, if he isn't incorporated in, he won't have. And these people are not going to come voluntarily. So it's better for them, for us to make them into slaves because their lives are better lives. You say, yeah, but that sounds crazy, Rabbi. I mean, who would do that? You do it all the time. You do it with children, don't you? What about the 10-year-old who wants a motorcycle or who wants to try cocaine? Or what? You simply say, no, I won't let you. You won't let me? That's right, I won't, because you're 10 years old and you're destroying your life. And you don't know that, and I do know it. I won't let you destroy your life. Or people who have intellectual limitations or emotional limitations. We create special living quarters for them. We create halfway houses for them. We create shelter workshops for them because left to their own devices, they'll ruin their lives. So the idea that we take away freedom, we use compulsion and power and force to govern people's lives for their good, when left to their own devices, they're going to make disastrous decisions. Everybody agrees to that. Then the only question is, what counts as a good life, a life that's worth living? How much benefit do you get from the incorporation versus losing your freedom? These are more subtle issues, but they're not the blanket, can you enslave another person or can't you enslave another person? The differences now become subtle and nuanced decisions. I'm not saying there are no differences in moral principle, but they are much, much less than one thinks. Now, this was hinted at in what I said 6 minutes ago, and 6 minutes from now, and that is that when you see a mitzvah and your moral intuition tells you that the mitzvah is not right, so first thing you have to do is clarify what the mitzvah is. And second of all, you may not know the circumstances under which the mitzvah is being applied or the consequences of the mitzvah, and that being the case, you may not realize that in fact it is good. Let me give you an example which is simplistic, but it helps to focus the idea and keep it in mind. Up until about 150 years ago, it was universal medical practice when a person had a fever to bleed him. Bleed him means you would take leeches or suction cups, you would make a cut in the skin and extract blood. It was felt that extracting blood would help reduce the symptoms and the danger of fevers. We don't do that anymore. Why not? Because we've discovered that it isn't good for your health. Bleeding is good for certain types of things, but not for fevers. Thank you very much. So now, what shall we say about the doctors who bled people? They were damaging, they were injuring their patients. Isn't that terrible? Yeah, the consequences are terrible. They were injuring their patients. Are they bad people? Do they have different values from us? Not at all. They were in the grips of false medical practice. So, that being the case, with all the goodwill, with all good character, having all the right values, they did actions that were injurious, harmful, because they had the wrong facts. So when you see people doing something which your moral judgment condemns, you have to ask yourself to step back and ask yourself, is it because we disagree about the facts, or is it because we disagree about the moral principles involved? Almost always, it's a disagreement about fact. A free market or a controlled market? The difference that people have, part of the difference is simply, what do you think will be a more productive system? That has nothing to do with right and wrong, or good and evil. It's just a question of the market, the system of the market is supposed to produce results. And the question is, which one will produce the better results? Better means in productivity. So now, why do I bring all of this up? Because when the Rambam says that we're all born with the knowledge, well, I shouldn't say born, that's another story. It develops under normal conditions. We all are given by our created nature knowledge of good and evil. He means knowledge of good and evil moral principles. He doesn't mean the knowledge of good and evil particular actions, because the particular action depends upon moral principles plus the facts. That's not guaranteed here. That's not delivered here. What's delivered here is only the moral principles. And that's what's necessary to be able to make decisions between good and evil altogether. So, the idea that I know what's good and what's evil because God told me is now, at least on the level of moral principles, is now directly contradicted by what the Rambam says, word for word. Okay, now, the question will become, this is now, for those who know a little philosophy, this is familiar from a problem, Havdil, that Plato talked about called the Euthyphro problem. Does the Torah then become irrelevant to morality? It says, I know what's good and evil, what's right and wrong on my own. What room does the Torah have to determine for me what's right or wrong? If it has no room whatsoever, it would mean that the Torah in particular, and perhaps religion generally, has no moral status. It has no moral authority. And that seems to me would very much reduce the scope of religion in general, and certainly would go against the way we understand the place of the Torah. And the answer is, now for the third time, what I've just been telling you. We know the principle of morality, but to know in particular what actions are right or wrong, that requires a grasp of the facts. And the normal understanding is that the Creator, who's unlimited in power and knowledge, has a grasp of the facts far exceeding ours, so as to say that this particular action is right or wrong is something which He can say and we can't know. Not because He's determining the principles of right and wrong or good and evil, not because He's inventing morality, but He knows what is really good and what is really evil. Because He knows the facts much better than we do. Like, for example, the case of reincarnation, which I told you. Now, so that's one obvious way in which the Torah is still relevant to morality, even though the principles we know on our own. But there's another way. Because what happens when there's a commandment which, for all we can see, doesn't have consequences of good and evil at all? It looks just arbitrary, like tefillin, or not wearing shatnez, or something else. You could always say there are hidden benefits and hidden damages that you're not aware of. You could say that, but there's only more that you could say. And now I'm going back to what I said from Rabbi Shimon Shkop in this forum to talk about gratitude. Let's go back to gratitude. Gratitude tells me that if somebody did something for me, if he benefited me in some way, I owe him something. He can't collect in court, I owe it to him morally. So for example, if I'm drowning in a river, somebody saves my life, 2 weeks later he says to me, I need to borrow $500, can you lend it to me? And simultaneously someone down the street, whom I just said hello to once a month, says I need to borrow $500, and I have only $500 to lend. And I say, well, okay, here's George who saved my life. Here's the guy from down the street. They both need $500. I only have one $500. I'll flip a coin. Well, that's wrong, because George saved my life, you see. Because he saved my life, I owe him something that I don't owe to the guy down the street. So it's morally incorrect to decide by flipping a coin. What I should say is, since he saved my life, I owe him in a way that I don't owe the guy down the street. And therefore I have to lend it to George. That's true for everyone who benefits me. For everyone who benefits me. Big benefits create bigger obligations. Smaller benefits create smaller obligations. Now apply that general principle to the Creator. I get an enormous, enormous amount of benefit from the Creator. According to the principle of gratitude, because He provides me with all that good, He gets moral authority over me, because I owe Him in terms of the good that He gave me. So it's not just that God might know that this action is good or evil in terms of the independent values, and I don't know because I don't know the facts. Here's something a little bit more subtle and confers upon God an extra moral authority. And that is that since He does so much good for me and I owe Him, when He commands something, because maybe to do something, it becomes obligatory because of my debt. Let me work this out in detail so you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's go back to George. He saved my life. Let's suppose George calls me up and he says, you know something? I need to paint my living room green. I need help. Can you come over Sunday afternoon and help me put my living room green? I said, listen, let's see. He saved my life. Do I owe him an afternoon's help in painting his living room green? I guess so. It's within the limits of the debt. Now suppose he said purple instead of green. Would that change it? I don't think so. That's purple, green. Suppose he said I need help in balancing my checkbook. We say, oh no. Painting the living rooms, yes, but balancing checkbooks, no. I mean, I owe him for saving my life. He wants a couple of hours of my time. Does it matter what it is he asks me to do? In what way I can help him? Assuming that what he's asking me to do isn't wrong on its own account. He has an open-ended lever on my response. He has a sort of blank check against me where he can write in the particular amount that he wants, because I owe him a debt of gratitude, but there's nothing specific about that. To pay a debt of gratitude is to do for him what he wants, what he needs. So that means here God gets a kind of moral authority, but he gets it secondhand. The principle of paying your debts of charity is independent. I know that because God created me with that knowledge. I don't have to be told that by anybody. I know that because I understand what gratitude is and what debts are and what obligations are. But He gave me so much that now I have that debt of gratitude to Him, and then He can collect it in very many different ways, and whatever way He decides to collect it becomes an obligation for me because He told me He wants it. There doesn't have to be anything independently good in painting his living room green. That may not be good, it may not be bad, it may be just arbitrary, but it becomes obligatory on me because I have a debt of gratitude to him. Now this is a binyanav, this is a particular case, but it has other applications. What you do is, you take a moral principle, which creates statements of good and evil, right and wrong, obligation and all the rest, in general terms. Then you ask, what does God do? How does He relate to the universe? What does He make happen in the universe? And you ask, when He does those things, do those things trigger one of these principles? Anyone who does these things would have these principles apply. God is doing these things, so they apply to Him. When the principles apply to Him, that gives Him moral authority. And then, when He commands something, it becomes obligatory because of that background moral principle which triggered His authority. Debts of gratitude is one example. I'll give you one other example. Yeah.
So in this situation with John, wouldn't we say we're helping him, we're giving him $500 because he needs that? What would God need from us then?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with need. It has to do with what He wants. But want and need aren't the same thing. I can want something for you, not for me. He tells me, I want you to do this. I owe Him. to do for him what he wants because I owe him a debt of gratitude. I don't have to independently determine whether he needs it or not. If it's going to hurt him, then I could say, well, I have an obligation to do what to pay my debt of gratitude, and I have an obligation not to hurt him. So the two obligations, then I have to decide which obligation is stronger. But to create the obligation, it's just the fact that he benefited me, and I have that debt of gratitude to him.
If it was a situation, it was like, I just want to paint that rock green, or something that seems so trivial or something.
What difference does it make?
Is it, okay.
Right? If he spent an hour and a half helping me with something, it's going to take me an hour to paint the log green. I can deduct the hour from the hour and a half and say I owe him a half hour because I did what he wanted. I don't care what the consequences are, unless it'll be bad. We spoke about that already. Here's another moral principle. Moral principle of property, owning property. Someone who owns property has the authority to determine how it shall be used. Yes, within limits, you can't use it to shoot people and so forth and so on. Okay, we know that. But he has a certain authority to decide how the property shall be used. Other people, other things being equal, shouldn't interfere with his use of his property. Now, what constitutes property is a very difficult subject. And there are all sorts of subtleties. But I don't need them. Because if you create something out of nothing, if you give it its entire existence, then it's your property. That's a clear case. Acquiring it on the open market and digging holes and so forth and so on may be a complicated case. But creating something out of nothing definitely makes it your property. So the world, the universe, because God creates it, is his property. Leave out people. There are those who want to talk about us as his property and use that as a lever to get all sorts of consequences. Leave it out. It's controversial. Leave it out. But he owns the land. He owns the airspace. He owns the factories. He owns the food. Right? All those things can be owned and are owned, and he can own all of them. Okay. Now, God says to Jews, don't eat pigs. Translation, they're my pigs, and I don't give you permission to eat them. Therefore, a Jew who eats a pig is a thief. A Jew who eats a pig is a criminal, is a moral criminal. He's stealing someone else's property, capital S, capital E, someone else's property, and stealing property is morally wrong. Because it belongs to him as property, he has moral authority to determine how it shall be used. Someone who uses it against his command is violating that moral authority and doing something morally wrong. Here's another case where we have an independent moral principle, the principle of property, and then you say, well, whoever has property gets the benefit of this principle. Among others, God has that property, so he gets the benefit also. Of course, his benefit is gigantic because he's creating the whole universe. And then, when he tells me how the property should be used, I have an obligation to use it the way that he says, within limits. Yes, we know the Sodom problem. We've mentioned it a bunch of times. This has a very important consequence. That means that someone who eats pigs is doing something immoral. I grew up in Reform Judaism. One of the many colossal mistakes that they made anyway, maybe they corrected since then, was to distinguish between two types of mitzvos. Moral mitzvos and ritual mitzvos. Moral mitzvos like don't kill, don't steal, don't defame people, give charity, pursue justice. Moral mitzvos. And then ritual mitzvos like don't eat pigs, and blow a horn in this fall and eat crackers in the spring, and things that are just rituals. And the implication was moral mitzvahs are really important because if you violate a moral mitzvah, then that's immoral and that's not good. But if you violate a ritual mitzvah, so then you're not a ritual. Like, so what? What difference does it make? Comes out now that all mitzvahs are moral. They're all moral. What the Reform forgot, and you can understand why they forgot it, is that we have a moral relationship to God also, not just to other people. And the context of a moral relationship to God, violating his will be immoral because of the debt of gratitude, because of the fact that he has property rights and other moral principles as well. So it comes out that religion is relevant to actual moral decisions, actual moral facts, in at least two different ways. If religion is based on the idea of a creator who knows all there is to know, then when he tells you to do something, it's quite reasonable to expect that he knows things about the cases you don't know, which if you knew them, you would know that the case itself is moral by itself. You wouldn't need God to tell you to do it if you had the information. You just don't have the information. That's one way. I would say that's a sort of simplistic way, but it's true. And then secondly, the independent moral principles give authority to those who meet the conditions of the principle, whoever they are. God meets the conditions of those principles and therefore gets moral authority. When he exercises that moral authority, in that way, he creates obligations which didn't exist before. And they can be for actions which otherwise would be trivial. But they become moral, they're blinding because of his moral authority. By the way, if you study the Euthyphro problem, this is the solution. The Euthyphro problem is it A or B? And the answer is neither. It's C. It's a kind of compromise between the two, which isn't discussed in the philosophical literature so far as I know. But that's our solution. I think it's the right solution. At any rate, this now saves the idea that religion is very important to actual practice of morality. You couldn't have the practice that we have without the religious input, but the principles are independent. Now, somebody's hand was up before. So a question? Yes.
Just on you were saying about the debt of gratitude that you owe. Surely the debt of, on the one of the where you're saying the debt of gratitude. That's why we owe God. God gets the moral rights.
I'm not getting your words. I'm not getting
One of the arguments you're making was the debt of gratitude we owe, and therefore we can dictate.
the retro question.
Debt of gratitude.
The debt of gratitude. Yes.
The debt that we owe, surely it's not just that he benefited us, it's that he put an effort to help us. We owe him an hour and a half of work as opposed to an hour and a half of benefits.
I don't think that's right. I think that the amount of effort the benefactor expends may increase the debt, but I don't think that it is the whole measure of the debt. If Bill Gates, seeing that my business is about to go under, lends me $500,000, he can't even see it in his checkbook. $500,000 is zero. For a man with $50 billion, $500,000 doesn't exist. I owe him a debt of gratitude. He saved my business. The fact that he didn't sweat over it doesn't mean there's no debt of gratitude. I think that's a mistake. It's a moral mistake. Yeah.
So why we find a lot of the moral facts in the Torah somehow hinted or not? Sometimes we have to interpret and to find the meaning behind in between the lines or you know like so how do we apply a system to see the moral facts that the Torah is because there are things that you reread and like this week's parasha has some very particular
I don't hear the question. The words you said were, why are the moral facts sometimes between the lines, requires significant interpretation to find them, they're not all explicit. What I'm telling you is that every mitzvah is moral. There are no separate moral facts on one page, the other page, other things that aren't moral facts, and then you can make a contrast. The things that aren't moral facts are explicit and open and easy to understand, and the moral facts are difficult to understand and difficult to interpret, so how come there's that difference? There is no such question. Every mitzvah now is morally binding. So if there's any mitzvah that's hard to understand or needs interpretation, that's a moral fact that needs interpretation. And any mitzvah that's open and clear and explicit, that is a moral fact that's open and clear. And they're all moral facts. My point is that they're all moral facts, all of them. They're just not all independent moral facts. Very rarely does the Torah talk moral language. It talks command language. It says, thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that. Doesn't say this is right and wrong. It does sometimes, but much more often it just tells you what to do. And I'm claiming they're all moral facts, all of them. I don't hear the question. The way you're putting it, I don't hear the question. It isn't as if there's a separate subject of moral facts, and over there's a lot of obscurity. There's a lot that's hidden, and other places it's more clear. That's just not correct as far as I can tell. Yeah. So I guess I'll just about finished. There are things which I just mentioned this. I should do this in a whole hour. There are things that are written down. There are things that are understood that aren't written down. There are things that are understood that can't be written down. I'm quoting a Ramban now. There are two mitzvahs in the Torah which the Ramban links. One is Kedoshim Tihu, you should be holy. And the other, you should Tova Yosher B'Einei Hashem. You should do with what is good and right, straight in the eyes of Hashem. And the Ramban says on both of them that Chodesh Baruch Hu adopted the following strategy. He told us lots and lots of specific things to do, and defined them. And then he said, but that's not all. That's not all. Come on, I'm overwhelmed with it. No, that's not all. In addition, there are directions in which you need to grow, directions in which you need to extend yourself. And there, I'm not writing it down for you. I'm just telling you, these are the directions in which you need to grow and extend yourself. And the Ramban says because it's impossible to write them all down. So when I first read that, I thought, really? Now let's see. The Ramban's commenting on a book that's written by the creator of the universe. The infinite creator of the universe. He couldn't write it down? What exactly does the Ramban mean? But then I understood. It could be written down in 10 trillion pages, but we couldn't read it and do anything with it. It can't be written down for us. Writing it down won't be a way to communicate it to us. And so this idea of having specific cases and then having an extension principle. So there are things, I've always shared, it's non-linguistic Torah, there are things that are understood that aren't put into language. There are even theorems in logic and mathematics that not everything can be put into language. And this also is part of the tradition. There's a kind of moral judgment built into a person after he experiences the Torah and processes all the input of the Torah that changes his own judgments about about what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. And that becomes another way in which there's a source of knowledge. It's a hybrid. You take what you've been commanded, but then it's processed by your own internal faculties, and then it produces a new output. Din in the Mar Mitzvah is one of the cases which the Ramban brings. It's a famous case. Imagine a case like this. I'm selling a field. I have two bidders. They both offered the same amount of money. One bidder has a field adjacent to mine, and the other bidder has his field distant from mine. They've offered the same amount of money. I can flip a coin. What do I care? So listen to what the halacha is. This is really an astonishing halacha. Suppose I decide to sell it to the buyer who has a field distant from mine. So he comes, I write out the contract, he gives me the money, I give him the document of ownership of the field, and as a result of that, the other one owns the field. He doesn't own it. It's not his. He involuntarily becomes a shliach for the other buyer, and the other buyer gets the field. You can't sell it to the one that's more distant. You can't do it. It's undone. It's not valid. Why? Because it's much more efficient and useful for a person to have two fields together. And since you, the seller, are being offered the same amount of money, why shouldn't you do what's more beneficial to the recipient? This guy with the adjacent field will get more benefit out of my field than the guy with the distant field. Not only should I do that, but the halacha forces the outcome in a very dramatic way. Of course, this guy who paid the 500 will ask the other buyer to give him the 500 so he doesn't lose money, but he doesn't get the field. This is something which was not part of the Masorah coming down from Moses. This is something which the rabbis invented on this idea of doing what's yashar, tov v'yashar b'einei Hashem. They saw this would be good and straight in Hashem's eyes, and they instituted it. This is a principle of generating new halacha, new ways of operating in order to enforce these moral principles. And these moral principles, as I say, are kind of hybrid. When you learn all of the things that are in the halacha, and then you see how things operate, and you look at the situation, you say, that can't be. That can't be. So this is another kind of way in which the Torah's input creates morality. So it's a long and subtle issue. But the bottom line for me is that simplistic view, you just simply read the book and it tells you what to do, that's not the right answer. The answer is much more complicated than that. Okay? All right.